Hello, we've had, nope, we're not doing that.
Keep that in, Matt.
Mm-hmm. So we're here, we're here today to talk about a really big story in psychedelia with a long and complicated history. We're going to be talking about William Leonard Pickard, and I'm here with Brian Normand.
Hey.
And Nishay Devino.
Hey.
And as always, Dave Nichols.
Hey, good to be here.
And I'm Brian Pace. So William Leonard Pickard is sort of a legendary figure, complicated, allegedly was an LSD chemist
he was an LSD chemist.
Right.
Yeah.
In the case that we'll be discussing, allegedly manufactured the 90% of the LSD in the world for some period of time, is associated with the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, and also had quite the Ivy League pedigree. So this story covers a Kansas missile silo and a couple of other miscreants, Gordon Todd Skinner, someone who has been celebrated, Crystal Cole, and some other characters that we'll get into.
And Crystal Cole, for people who have kind of kept an eye on the psychedelic community for some years, might know her as NeuroSoup. She had a kind of early YouTube series where she would talk about drugs and psychedelics in general, routes of administration. So NeuroSoup is another name for Crystal.
Mm-hmm. So all of this stuff happened, really came to a head in the early aughts. And I guess in the sort of general story of how people think about Pickard and his impact and the impact of his arrest, it's been put forth that, the acid drought of the early aughts was attributed to this arrest. And there was a time I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and you could buy LSD on the street, and then you couldn't. This story has been discussed a lot. And when William Leonard Pickard was released from prison recently.
Yeah, I mean, that's the big news. I think we should stress that the reason we are doing this now is that William Leonard Pickard, after serving a 20-year prison sentence in federal, maximum security, whatever prison, was just a week or two ago released, specifically because of how out of control COVID-19 coronavirus has become in the prison population. So he was actually serving 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole, but that was overturned by the judge as a result of how insane the COVID situation became. So just as some kind of framing context for this conversation.
Yeah, it was compassionate release.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, that's sort of the background, but there's significant gaps. I mean, Pickard himself wrote a book. Nishay, you've done a lot of work on that book.
Yeah, I have it for those of you who are viewing this. I have it here. It's a massive book, so like 600, 500 pages. Yeah, about 650 pages long, that he wrote with, pencil in prison over the past, I don't know how many years. He did it. I believe he did a whole other version and then ended up trashing it and starting it over. So it's many years in the making. And it's basically an autobiography through a magical realist, so like fictional-ish lens. And for those of you who are familiar with psychedelic literature, has a long pedigree, whether the Shulgins, Pikal and Tikal is a sort of fictionalized truth autobiography, even back to Humphrey Davy with nitrous oxide, writing Constellations and Travel. So it's definitely part of that lineage.
Yeah, a lot of people are reading it right now.
Yeah, it was recently we saw had jumped into the top 10 scientific biographies on Amazon or something.
It was number bestseller. 1 like a day after that we broke that story. that I saw it pop into #1, which was funny because there was a bunch of psychedelic books in the top 10 on there.
Well, psychedelics are going mainstreaming.
Mhm.
But yeah, I guess one of the things that sort of stands out with regards to this story and these stories and this case, both as far as the release, as far as Pickard's incarceration, as far as the initial bust, is that we have a sort of series of intertwined stories, the standard story, the contradictions in some of those stories, the potentially actual story, and to what sense do any of us have a corner on the truth? It's probably not so great. We have senses of probabilities, things that make sense, things that don't make sense, questions. So there are these claims that get bandied about what percentage of the LSD supply was coming from the missile silo, and to what extent the DEA even had the means to make such conjectures. And in the case of, say, Pace discussing the LSD drought, some people have speculated, well, hey, it wasn't just that there was this missile silo bust, it's that, other chemists sort of saw what was going on and decided to clamp down on their own production. As Nishay has pointed out, Pickard himself denies the allegations that he was manufacturing in the silo. And in fact, I believe it's in the Rose of Paracelsus, Pickard's book, where he's discussing that he was actually there trying to shut the lab down, that the lab wasn't being used, or he wasn't using the lab to produce LSD. And in fact, his reasons for getting involved with Skinner in the first place weren't out of some desire to produce unholy amounts of acid, but rather he recognized that Skinner was a dangerous and otherwise problematic character who needed some sort of intervention, and that he was in a position to intervene as a result of getting sort of wrapped up with Skinner, who was an informant and who went, to the authorities.
Let's back up on Skinner being an informant, because, what we're talking about, and I think what we're trying to untangle here, and we'll be doing so on some YouTube videos in the future here, is that there are directly conflicting narratives here. And, we have to evaluate sort of the credibility of these individuals. So you just mentioned that Gordon Todd Skinner had been an informant, and he informed on William Leonard Pickard. But this wasn't even the first time that he had been an informant. He had been an informant in several cases where he initiated the investigations, and other cases where he informed to save his own skin when he would have otherwise been indicted.
He already had the various government organizations circling around him by the time he decided to frame Leonard for producing with the lab. He had previously he was being looked at for manslaughter because people had been at his involved in his circle, and then he'd overdosed them with drugs multiple occasions. In one case, someone actually died because they weren't taken to the hospital for medical treatment. And so it was in that context that the kind of setting up Leonard happened.
Yeah, I really recommend, if you want to kind of get a scope of Skinner working as an informant, on the free Pickard website, there's a really long Gordon Todd Skinner timeline that's really, really in depth and take a while to read, but you can see the extent to which he had been working as an informant, and it seemed like it was kind of his MO going back to the 80s.
Yeah, I mean, he came from sort of a G-man family. His stepfather was a Fed.
He's an IRS agent or something like that.
I think he sort of transitioned through a couple
Treasury Department.
There we go.
Yeah.
But he's in his own account now. Of course, he has. Well, in his own account, he says that he grew up around, a revolving door of the sort of alphabet soup of different government agents, and that he in some ways learned the drug business from the informant game.
Yeah, and to be clear, like as we're talking about some of these conflicting and questionable narratives, you know, looking at Skinner has always sort of raised certain questions for me, precisely because he couches some of his drug savvy as though like, ooh, you know, there were these federal agents coming by the house, and I sort of by osmosis I sucked up, you know, this knowledge of drugs, and it's like, okay, but let's interrogate that a little bit. And you know, there's another article, and we'll link to some of these in the show notes, but there was an article that was in This Land Press that, you know, I'll just go ahead and state there are certain issues with citations at various points. There are certain things that seem to be worthwhile and that are verifiable that get reported in that story. There are other things where the claims are sort of questionable. But in this piece and in a few other pieces I've seen floating around, there is sort of a verification or a construction of Skinner's chemical proficiency that makes claims of, oh, as a high school student, he was able to extract alkaloids and he brought a tank of nitrous to school. And so if we go all the way back to his youth, we have all of this documentation that, of course, he was the type of chemically inclined person who was able to eventually wind up synthesizing LSD. And like, you know, having helped run the DMT Nexus for a while, like, we see all sorts of high school kids, you know, we try to bounce the people who are, you know, under 18. But like you see all sorts of teenagers and young folks who show up who it doesn't take a whole lot to extract alkaloids from plant material. And so to sort of set up this notion of, well, as a high schooler, he was extracting alkaloids and bringing nitrous.
Like he was some kind of like chemical prodigy.
Right. It doesn't really present that. And similarly, you know, Pickard's account of certain Skinner or Skinnerian tactics where he apparently shows up and starts engaging in all sorts of gobbledygook, right? Like listing off alphabetamines and sort of, ooh, here, I'm aware of all of these esoteric chemicals you've never heard of. So
alphabetamines, can you provide some context for people who don't like know?
So
that's
right.
kind of like
so
an inside term.
Can you also provide some context on, what did you just say? Skinnerian?
Well, I just wanted to, that was sort of off the cuff, the behaviors and tactics of one Skinner. But in as far as alphabetamines, so, you know, we have tryptamines and phenethylamines as far as the sort of major types of psychoactive or psychedelic compounds. You know, say look at Shulgin's breakdown of p-cal and t-cal split into phenethylamines and tryptamines I have known and loved. But so alphabetamines sort of is off the cuff. I think the first time I heard it used was in the context of the Aeroids, where we were chatting about a lot of the novel research chemicals that were appearing, you know, things with very limited histories of human use or no histories of human use whatsoever. Things that were coming out of the Dave Nichols lab, looking at things like the N-bones, and other sort of novel, what happens if we tweak the molecules and the structures off these pre-existing compounds, and how do these interface with our own neurochemistry and what experiences come out of that. In court testimony, Skinner makes a number of comments about how it would be sort of easier for him to list the compounds he hasn't tried than the ones that he had. And so that sort of, and I think I would assume most of us have probably encountered people in the scene, or whatever you want to call it, who are very intent on pissing contests, right? The sort of psychedelic one-upmanship of, I've done more things than you've done, I've got more experience, I've got more familiarity, and this notion of people who like to show up and sort of play chemist. And to be clear, like, I'm no chemist, but I've been in plenty of situations where somebody pops up and starts spitting all sorts of jargon, trying to convince people that they know more than they do. And so that sort of claim to knowledge and expertise is something that appears to crop up around Skinner, and something that, you know, I had questions about. And until Nishay read that passage, or those passages discussing Pickard's approach to Skinner, which almost seems like it comes from a harm reduction perspective.
Absolutely.
You know, to me, it suddenly
which
clicked
passages
some
are we talking about, though?
in place.
So Leonard's version of what happened in the Rose of Paracelsus is at odds with the commonly accepted story around the silo. So Dave's referring to Leonard's account of what happened, which to my mind is way more credible than the current story of Leonard was just this guy who wanted a bunch of money and didn't realize he was getting involved with someone shady.
And there's another book out there as well. Crystal Cole wrote a book called Lysergic.
Have any of you guys? I haven't actually read it yet.
God, I guess we have to read it.
If anyone's read it, email us.
Yeah, reviews would be helpful.
So, and we've brought up NeuroSoup already. It's worth commenting. Like, if you go through the sort of internet forum record, NeuroSoup was widely panned by most sort of heads and folks in the underground.
It was actually it was a concerted effort. Like, she was getting invited to places like the Telluride Mushroom Festival, places like festivals as a kind of figurehead, or a person who could speak authoritatively on psychedelics or on behalf of the psychedelic community. And it was heads, largely on forums that made a concerted effort to kind of question those decisions to platform her, and eventually she was increasingly deplatformed.
Yeah, there were a lot of concerns about quality of information, harm reduction concerns, some of her involvement with, let's say, promotional activities. For a while she was running promotions, advertisements for Bouncing Bear Botanicals, which eventually got busted by the DEA for selling plants that had Schedule I chemicals in them. At that point, Crystal Cole served as, or was brought in as, state witness.
She was the main witness.
Right. Against Bouncing Bear Botanicals. So, I've brought up before when folks tried to sort of defend her for her role in cooperation with the state around the missile silo and events related to that even if we leave that sort of off the table, we can look at the case of Bouncing Bear, and there are huge questions as to the sort of risks and willingness to cooperate, risks to other people in the community based on Crystal Cole's willingness to cooperate with the sate.
Didn't you say there was some secondary effects of that case in terms of the availability of various materials, or is that separate?
That's kind of separate. It was, so Bouncing Bear happened a little bit before, I think it was a couple years before the bust of Sonoran Song, which
looks like it happened in 2010. And
yeah, Sonoran Song got busted in 2011. That was an immigration customs enforcement, and I think Customs Border Patrol, sort of collaboration against the main importer of Mimosa tenuiflora, Mimosa hostilis. At that point, most DMT extractors in the state sort of switched from extracting from Mimosa to Acacia. That's sort of a whole other can of worms. But dealing with some of the questions about informing and sort of the sordid events. I mean, I guess before we get too much into the shit of this, as we tend to do, can we just take a moment and acknowledge the fact that Pickard is out? Pickard is
yeah.
Let's do that.
Can we start actually with that story of just here how we heard kind of what we did about it, and then we can get into the kind of the bullshit after.
So I was on the phone. I was on the phone with Dave, and he just goes, "Holy shit!" I was like, "What?" He's like, "What?" And Pace had sent our group chat on Signal. Did you send the Julie Holland link?
It was a screenshot from Twitter because I'm an extremely online person, and it was 15 minutes after she had posted. And as far as we're aware, there's no other. That was the first public mention.
And she specifically said that if anyone else cared about Leonard as she did, or had written letters, in favor of him as she did, then wanted to know, she was sharing the good news.
Right. And then, I mean, I guess at that point, the Symposia crew sprung into action.
Yeah. I was like, let's immediately get something.
Someone said, we should put something up, and Norman was already on it. He was already.
Oh yeah.
I was working on the retweet. And,
I was. Julie Holland is a credible source, someone that had been communicating with him for a while. So
As a friend
I
of
trusted.
his.
Yeah, I trusted that.
She wrote this book.
Yeah.
So that's a complete ecstasy, the complete guide.
Yeah, for those of you who aren't watching.
Yeah, so we put something up right away on Instagram for that, and we sent out a tweet.
We should also say that we already earlier in July had sent out to our mailing list that we were going to be working on a kind of series around Leonard's kind of both his work in the form of the Rose of Paracelsus, and we were talking about trying to, get a public initiative going to try to advocate for his release. So when we found out he was released, it was, exciting to hear.
Yeah, it was super weird.
Cause for celebration. And I mean, I think though that does, that's worth sort of talking a little bit about, because I remember we had a somewhat late night conversation talking about sort of the damned injustice of it.
I was getting pretty pissed because we were just randomly talking about that on a call one night, and I was just
like the
really
corporate actors,
because of thinking about all of the corporations moving in, and here you have this fucking guy sitting in a jail cell for 20 years. He's going to die in prison, and I don't see any of these companies out there, being outraged about that.
Specifically the opposite in the case of some of the folks. So Russell Hausfeld wrote a piece on J.R. Rahm and his statements on not wanting to be associated with these decrim people.
Sure.
I think he's maybe revised his statements, but he really hasn't come out strong saying the drug war is bad.
That's called damage control. When you go out into when you go out into Forbes and you say I don't care about the decrim people, I think that you're just believe what I believe you.
I believe you too. Yeah. I mean, I think if anything, it was a signal, to him and his sort of fellow travelers that maybe.
Well, Mr. Shark Tank doesn't want to be associated with those dirty criminals.
Sure.
So and then we and Russell, who is amazing, he hopped on the story immediately and reached out. We got a couple sources. We reached out. Nishay, you had a source as well.
It looks like Nishay is having some technical difficulties with her mic. We will see if she can get back here.
I mean, we had.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's
there
great.
You are.
Welcome.
Yeah, thanks. I was just going to say, Lee Pinsky has for a long time been an awesome kind of mid person in communicating with Leonard for me in prison. So I reached out and was like, is it so? What's the deal? And he was able to send me the actual the document. I forget the name. The order.
Memorandum in order.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That had the signed the judge's signature and everything. So
and then you, Nishay, within 20 minutes had a video that was it was great. We had the article, you had the video immediately.
It was exciting. I just spontaneous because we just have gotten into YouTube very recently, and I have no prior skills with video or anything, but I just decided to share the news on YouTube, and if we had a scheduled meeting that night in an hour, and in that short time was able to kind of do a read through of the document, very quickly edit it, throw it, upload, and then we slide into our meeting. But it was a very kind of just spontaneous thing.
Well, it was a moment where it's everybody was in the right place at the right time, where not only was the team sort of available to do the different components, but was also available for, say, reviewing the video as it was about to go up, or sort of spot checking the article, pulling various references as we then pulled the longer article together, sort of checking with the various sources that we had, plus the secondary sources. And, as it all came together, it was the kind of thing where both on, say, social media, as well as once it was up, the YouTube, you could sort of see the momentum gathering. And, for us, at least for me, it was a rather bizarre experience where we were all sort of tittering away inside, excitedly trying to figure out what else we could find out, what else we could share, who else we could approach to sort of get more details on the developing story. And at the same time, we could see the the excitement, the hunger, the engagement coming from folks online. As I mean, looking specifically at that YouTube video, you know, it got quite a bit of momentum, and you know, next thing we knew, it was shooting up in views, and then it was being shared on Reddit. And
yeah, we've never had anything with 100,000 views within 24 hours. Like that was definitely like the first time.
Yeah, and just to be clear for people like who are not familiar with Pickard, this is like the biggest psychedelic drug war prisoner. You know, this is the number one. And Timothy Tyler, who also we did a story on a couple years ago. He had served, I believe, 24 years in prison, and we did a story on him a couple years ago. But the Pickard case was certainly there was more press about it. It was more of a,
I mean, it was the DEA like used this case practically to justify its existence for several years in the early aughts.
Right.
Like we got the guy, you know, who was producing 90% of the LSD according to them. But you know, Nishay, I wanted to just clarify for our listeners. You know, you've been corresponding with Leonard for a long time.
Yeah, he reached out to me a few years ago now. And mentioned his book and that he'd heard good things about me. And because I specifically study psychedelic literature, I mentioned earlier in this episode that series of kind of psychedelic literature, fictional but not fiction, and that's literally what I did my dissertation on. And so when he brought his book to me, it kind of felt like I'd been, you know, preparing my whole life to kind of research and teach this book, and because it was in line with everything else I was doing. So he kind of realized that, and I realized that, and we started a correspondence.
Yeah, and because I know she's not going to brag on herself, I'm going to go ahead and say that in an interview with Pickard in the Oak Tree Review titled "Sea of Radiance," Pickard actually describes Nishay as, quote, the most promising interpreter of psychedelic literature. So, you know, it's kind of wild to see some of these connections. And I mean, going beyond some of the discussions we'd been having internally about sort of how to engage with this case in the context of corporadelic organizations sort of throwing around millions and millions of dollars for pharmaceutical bullshit. And our own desire to sort of highlight issues around Pickard and ongoing drug war questions. We also had the fact that in the article that I had recently published, We Need to Talk About MAPS, supporting the police, the military, and violent white supremacism. I had highlighted the case of Pickard because there was a DEA informant, John Halpern, who was a MAPS researcher working at Harvard, who was involved in the Silo case. And Eric Davis had discussed this in an article. John Hanna had discussed this in an article at the time. You know, Rick Doblin acknowledged the fact that Halpern was an informant, as did Neil Goldsmith, and both of those folks went to bat for Halpern, saying, hey, psychedelic research is actually the most important thing. Like, yeah, Halpern has served as an informant, has worked with the feds, has, you know, sort of compromised the communal safety, but also we don't think Halpern is an ongoing threat, and frankly, the contributions he's making to psychedelic science are actually so important, and the notion of us getting a foothold back in Harvard is so important that, you know, we need to overlook all of this. And I think that sort of ends justify the means. Don't actually fret about how safe you are or aren't. Don't actually question, you know, what this means for a criminal subculture to sort of openly be inviting, cooperating, you know, state cooperators.
Well, if your buddy is actively snitching to the DEA, do you invite him to your party where other people might have illegal substances on them?
So it's like when you're still involved in the underground, the community, while you're like a known informant, snitch, whatever you want to call it, you're jeopardizing. It's like if you're going to make that choice to snitch, you should probably also make the choice to back out of the underground.
Can't have it
Yeah,
both
and the
ways.
fact that that's even a debate or discussion, the fact that this was even, sorry, Pace.
Well, actually, I think that, the people debating, that this, the folks that went to bat for Halpern are the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Study, MAPS. And, they occupy a place which is, they're trying to mainstream psychedelics, but they're really trying to bridge between the illegal to the legal. We're not the counterculture. We're the stream, to quote or paraphrase Rick Doblin. And so, in many ways, like that kind of behavior when you're occupying that space is, it's almost predictable. That said, I mean, everything's 2020 in hindsight. I did want to mention, though, that, before the publication of the We Need to Talk piece, we had tweeted out on Twitter, does anyone remember Halpern Gate? Mm-hmm. And I just want to sort of point to the kind of synchronicities that were popping up here, because, we were churning on this topic, and then it was just like out of nowhere, done. Leonard Pickard's out, right?
Sure.
Right as Dave's digging up the corpse of Halpern.
And didn't Halpern come forward? Wasn't he upset to be called a snitch?
He sent us an email. He sent a couple emails. We didn't
I think it's worth mentioning, just because there are other people who chimed in on that afterwards.
That's totally, yeah, John, if somebody sends you this audio, we absolutely got your emails and we didn't reply because we don't give a shit. He basically accused us of engaging in libel. He did accuse us of engaging in libel.
He said this is clear libel.
Yes. Fortunately, both the New York Post and San Francisco Gate have articles where he is clearly identified as an informant. This is on the record, aside from whatever court documents and discussions, aside from the actual court filings where Apperson and Pickard are both saying, we would like information on government informant Halpern, we have all of the documentation. We know it's not libel. We know that he was a snitch. These things are beyond question. But he reached out to bully us. He reached out to say, hey, you guys are dividing the community, which also, what a fucking snitch tactic. You guys are dividing the community, not me, not the person who snitched on my friends.
Additionally,
it ties into a lineage of that. Yeah, go ahead.
Someone who had worked in his laboratory came forward as well, basically saying that he had spoken about this to them. His snitching as well.
And can I just mention, because Dave brought up the issue of the ends justifying the means, and this is an ongoing sort of thing that we're exploring, just the ways that people do justify things according to these abstractions or these attachments or whatever else. And Rick Doblin, who's the director of MAPS, has stated, in a Boston Magazine interview from last year, that part of the reason why he's been living in Massachusetts all these years is how important it was for him to do away with the ghost of Timothy Leary and reestablish his psychedelic foothold at Harvard. So I just want to stress, even though Dave mentioned it, how important this goal was, and that justified all kinds of, decisions in between.
And and on top of that, just as a real quick point on, the point that Normie had just made about people acknowledging it. I mean, somebody on Twitter went ahead and said, I'm not sure that Halpern has ever publicly acknowledged cooperation, but he certainly has in private. He was actually quite flippant about it, and so this notion again of how people take up that space and how people want to be seen and how people are willing to engage in activities that go ahead.
Doblin has admitted that Doblin was working with Halpern. MAPS was funding the research that was occurring at Harvard at the time. Rick defended Halpern snitching, basically saying we need to give him another chance, blah, blah, blah.
So in some
Kind
ways,
of
like
ridiculous.
this conversation bleeds over to our previous conversation, because some of the topics that we were discussing when we were talking about we need to talk about maps and support for white supremacism and cops and all of that. I mean, it overlaps, because we're talking the conversation that ensued. Lots of folks chimed in to say, hey, I mean, this is politics, baby. Like, this is a good strategy, that kind of thing. And so Nishay was just talking about ends justifying means, and that's essentially the logic that is being employed here. A little while back, though, on our Twitter, because that idea was sort of churning about, we shared an Intercept piece discussing a recent interview with Republican Senator Tom Cotton, who declared, quote, "We have to study the history of slavery and its role and impact on the development of our country, because otherwise we can't understand our country. As the founding fathers said, it was the necessary evil upon which the Union was built." So a lot of people took offense to such a thing. That if one can justify, the great American empire, if you can justify chattel slavery, you can justify anything by that logic. And it just, like, anybody doing something shitty can say, yeah, well, I'm doing it for a very noble goal. It's just not a decent standard for I don't know, rationale, in my opinion.
Yeah, it doesn't hold up as an ethics kind.
And look, this outraged people at the time when this happened in 2006, when at the conference in Basel, when Mark McLeod from the audience, Rick Doblin was on stage with Halpern. McLeod stands up and goes off. And what's interesting when you watch the videos of it, John Gilmore, who's a board member of MAPS, is in the video basically saying, like, this story isn't good, Rick. I don't like this. And my understanding is that he was the donor who then pulled out funding at the time.
Well, he said any funding that he gave would only be used if it didn't go to Halpern research.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But that was for a lot of people, like, the first time that they heard about it, that was the moment that, like, put it on people's radar more broadly that this was an issue. But as Dave posting about this even recently, it showed how many people were still not aware of this major kind of moment in psychedelic history.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing, talking with people over the past, let's say, 5 years, you bring up Halpern Gate and the number of people who had no clue. I mean, especially, let's say, younger folks who are coming at this from the more sort of professionalized, less criminal. I mean, it's still very much criminal, but the people who don't see themselves as criminals, the people who see their substance use as so justifiable that, oh, surely I'm not a criminal. I want to be a psychedelic therapist.
This is one of the first stories that John Hanna's Halpern Gate is one of the first stories. If you're getting interested in this space, I think it's one of the first stories.
Yeah, the history of MAPS as an institution and just, all of that.
Well, and I would also say, just like having some understanding of who the Brotherhood of Eternal Love was and what they did, because I mean, acid wouldn't have been available to, I mean, these people manufactured the acid that the Beatles were taking. Like, it's hard to underestimate the cultural impact of these clandestine chemists.
And I really recommend, if anyone hasn't seen it, Orange Sunshine. Is that the documentary name?
Orange Sunshine. There was two, because the other one was the
Sunshine Makers.
Sunshine Makers was, I think, the one I was thinking of. That's the one that starts with Nick Sand and that animated thing. Yeah, because it just really emphasizes how those clandestine chemists were so, like, profit was not the point. And the DEA, which was used to going after drug people based on financial motives, had trouble dealing with these underground chemists because they were not in it for the money. They were in it because they believed that they were doing something important.
They weren't flashing cash and buying villas.
Right. Some people might give you some pushback around some of Sand's motives when it comes to cash, but yeah,
But I
I
think that there was this sense of,
for sure.
this will help people. This isn't like
Turn on the
fentanyl.
world.
Yeah, this wasn't like fentanyl where like it's going to mess people up.
Right.
Well, and similarly, one of the things, especially in the current moment of sort of respectability politics and this desire to sort of become mainstream and eschew questions of criminality and all the dynamics there, when you look at the Brotherhood and their smuggling operations, when you see sort of, and also when you look, it's kind of fucking mind-blowing to see how stripped back airport security was, like pre 9/11 by however many decades, and it's like, oh right, smuggling was like you strap something to the small of your back, you walk through, you didn't trip the metal detectors, and away you go.
To be clear, that still is happening though.
It is still happening.
Like
they just throw people at it, like and well, we send 100, and if 55 get through, that's still profit.
Yeah, now you just swallow balloons filled with heroin.
Right. But they also had an account in I believe it was Orange Sunshine. So Orange Sunshine dealt with the sort of the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, its genesis, and the sort of smuggling network, whereas the Sunshine Makers dealt with the chemists themselves. But in Orange Sunshine, there's an account of them going and getting like 5 passports in a single weekend, and they just kept showing up with different disguises. Great.
Times were different. But and also I think, just for the record, and I know we're not doing or at least this isn't a Brotherhood of Eternal Love episode, but just to point out there, it wasn't all love and light. Nothing in this space is all love and light, because I know there's going to be somebody who's listening to this being like, oh, you assholes, you're just glamorizing all the things.
You drank the Kool-Aid.
There's certainly a whole bunch of questionable decisions, behaviors, interactions, motives. Yeah, exactly. CIA, people are people. Social dynamics can get sketchy, especially when there's large quantities of drugs, cash, power.
Especially else. like pre-women's liberation and stuff, when things were just like insane for women generally, and then you think about throw psychedelics into the mix, and it's just crazy.
And a few crazy racist bikers.
Yep. Yeah, so there's a whole lot to unpack around that, and to sort of bring it back to Pickard, who had served time. My recollection is that early case, he was affiliated with the Brotherhood when he wound up serving time in California for attempted LSD manufacture.
That's 78. I think that was
something
78.
like that. And as Normie has pointed out, he served basically a third of his life in a cage.
I think he's done 20. He's 74. I think he's done 25 years.
Yeah,
I believe total.
Fucking nuts.
And his son, his 19-year-old son, who he was able to be with now, was born after he was arrested. So his son's entire life was, his dad was locked up.
And also just, and I'm going to invite Nishay to talk to this because she is far more acquainted with it than I, but like his, people have sent questions saying, hey, you guys have run this story where you're promoting Pickard's account of what happened. Like, do you really find that credible? Do you find that believable? There are these really interesting bits about the research that Pickard was doing as far as like ethnography of underground chemists, sort of predicting the fentanyl epidemic.
20 years like before it was a problem. He said it was going to be a problem, and like published articles about it.
Can you talk to some of the research he was doing?
Well, so just before I get to that, just real quick, because we're talking about part of the reason I wanted to mention the turn on the world positive motives behind some of the at least production of LSD was just seeing how the comments, like the people who came out of the woodwork to comment on our video, and it was trending on Reddit, the front page of Reddit. Like at first when someone, I think Pace, you first posted that it was trending, and I assumed just like I was probably on the Psychonaut subreddit, but it was on video subreddit. I was like, whoa, that's like a huge subreddit. And then it was actually on the front page, and people were reaching out to me saying, hey, I saw you on the front page of Reddit. And I was just blown away. It was like 1,000 comments, not that long after we posted it. And people were saying, like, there was one comment really stood out to me where someone was like, saying how he and his girlfriend had, you know, tripped together at one point, and that they now refer to LSD as like the gift, because as the girlfriend was tripping, she was like, this isn't a drug, this is a gift, you know, and just how profound it was. So it's like there was that side of, you know, the distribution where a lot of people are coming forward now and saying, wow, this super powerful, you know, primordially important experience in my life was due to people like Leonard, you know, who are locked up. So I just wanted to stress that first. And then to get to your point about, like, I don't know whether I've heard some talk about maybe a movie or something based on the Rose. I don't know how far along that is, but it's so deserving of a movie because his life is so crazy. I mean, he was locked away, you know, in the initial sentence which is why they were able to get him for life, because he had the priors on his record. But then he spent, you know, insanely long time at a monastery in the Bay Area, where he was like meditating. You know, I don't know if he was all the way at a level of a Zen monk, but he was like pretty far along that path. And then after that, he went to Harvard to get his degree. So he was there, I think, at the same time as Rick Doblin of MAPS, but he was studying international drug networks. And so part of his research was ethnographies, where he was going into underground, you know, into underground contexts where people were using, and he was kind of writing about what people were doing and where the flows of drugs were coming. And he actually, and he has you know, paperwork to back up a lot of the stuff, where he actually, the precursor to the KGB in Russia, he was in talks with them to kind of alert them to various drug issues and hear about the drug situation in Russia. And he has published on that. And he was also involved in stuff with the Middle East and had been speaking to, you know, people in Washington, the government, negotiating between these, you know, Afghani leaders and stuff, you know, pre 9/11. And so he has a super storied, colorful past, but that's why it makes so much sense when he gets to Skinner and he's interviewing him and is alerted to, oh, this guy is up to no good, because he was already doing that kind of ethnographic research, talking to people in the underground world, but from a legitimate standpoint of doing research. Like, he had that history already. So it would make sense for him to be interviewing Skinner in that context without trying to go into business with him.
Totally. And it also sort of, you know, brings us full circle back to when we were discussing some of these rather horrific events that have been associated with the silo. You know, it's really interesting hearing some people talk about how dark of an event the silo bust was, and whether that's because of questions about Halpern and involvement there, whether that's the issue of Skinner. And frankly, it was kind of surprising how many people were asking questions about Pickard and Skinner when we posted both the story and the YouTube video, where people seemed to be confusing Skinner with Pickard.
Yeah, explicitly, not just seemed to, like, some people were like, how dare they let that person out thinking it was Skinner.
Totally. And I got some very hostile Facebook messages about the horrible things that Pickard had done to Brandon Green, which is a whole other story that we're going to be giving some treatment on.
We'll touch on a little bit today. But.
Yeah, we should talk about that.
Well, I mean, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, finish what you were saying first, though.
Please do.
Well, I was just going to say, I got some rather hostile messages about it. And I said, well, look, you know, and I also had people saying, oh, well, you know, Pickard was a snitch. Pickard snitched on the Brotherhood. He did this, that, and the other. And, you know, I don't know what the reality is, but in all of those cases, I asked for evidence. I asked for documentation, you know, with regards to, say, our own reporting on Halpern's snitching. We had the documents that backed it up, both court documents as well as journalistic outlets that had reported on it. And so, you know, in the cases where people are going to say, oh, well, this is a thing that happened, if they can't provide some sort of credible, or at least, you know, citation that could be investigated and interrogated as to how likely is this, I feel rather skeptical. At the same time, seeing some of the animosity from folks who were concerned that, oh, well, why is the community sort of engaged in celebrating the fact that this guy who did these terrible things has now been released? It felt important to set the record straight. And this actually dovetails with some coverage that came out. You know, Hamilton Morris did a piece for Vice in which he
for a long time, this Vice documentary was like the de facto story of like a lot of people who knew.
High on crystal, by the way.
Yeah, a lot of people knew about the Silo bust, had seen this documentary. So it was very widely viewed, and it held a lot of weight in terms of people's interpretations.
Totally. And I think, I don't want to go so far as to say this is the reason why so many people conflate Skinner and Pickard, but like the way that the piece sort of structures everything, it's through the eyes of Crystal Cole, who is treated in a very sort of
credulous.
Yeah, totally. Where Morris sort of takes the things that she says as fact, seemingly doesn't compare her assertions to the actual record. I mean, there are, there's the pre-sentence investigation report that's up on the Free Leonard Pickard website. There's a whole bunch of other court documents that get into some of the brutal torture of Brandon Green that Skinner sort of instrumented or
let's
headed
talk about Brandon Green, because we haven't introduced him in
sorry.
The reason why Skinner is now in prison is because of what happened to Brandon.
Because this happened after the Silo bust, because Gordon Todd Skinner negotiated, as one does when one is a rather practiced government informant, snitch. He negotiated himself essentially immunity for this monumental case, and even potentially like the manslaughter and all the rest. He was he was giving Leonard over as this kind of like sacrifice to make everything else go away.
So
now, real quick, we haven't go ahead
before we get into the Brandon Green story and all that. Nishay, can you just kind of outline just continue what Pace was just saying? So Skinner is an informant on Pickard. Pickard is sentenced.
But also the lab, right? Like let's just get the fact that the lab, according to Pickard, right, the lab wasn't being used, or he wasn't using the lab to...
Yeah, so Leonard says that Skinner didn't have the credentials to be able to use the lab. He didn't have the skill set. And so all that he was doing was sitting on this stuff, and he was also the byproducts that had been, accumulated. He was selling off as various names of drug and injecting people with it, even though they were just literal byproducts of the lab. So that was what the lab was doing. And the DEA afterwards actually admitted that they didn't think that there was LSD production happening with that laboratory at the Silo. And Leonard was actually charged with conspiracy to produce and distribute. So it wasn't actual production.
Yeah, they had claimed that the DA had claimed that they had seized 92 pounds of LSD, but when it boiled down to it, it was like 92 pounds of liquid that perhaps a couple of grams of which maybe contained LSD.
Well, and this is sorry, Nishay, did you?
I was just going to say it's part of a pattern of like the government, I think, was it Dave that you said that the reason people switched to paper was because the sugar cubes weighed more?
They weigh the sugar cubes.
So this is the thing, the way the CSA is written, it says any amount of any material that contains any amount of a scheduled substance qualifies, is illegal, qualifies as that scheduled substance. So, if you're growing, so for example, Entropymancer, a sort of noted character in the underground, ran a story years ago about how Florida orange producers are making ungodly amounts of DMT because you could take the tree because you have a small, very, very small quantity of DMT that appears in the fruits, I believe. You could take the entire weight of the tree and technically prosecute somebody if you wanted to. I mean, that's how absurd the drug laws are.
In my case, I think they said I had like 100 pounds or something of weed or something, because they just snipped the base of the plant and then wet, and then they throw
that's so different
whatever.
From like actual, like if you were to say, I have an ounce, they don't measure it like that.
Totally.
Yeah, it's probably 90 plus pounds off, actually.
Right. So that makes it super easy in the case of, we've got a shitload of liquid that has like 0.0001% LSD. Well, shit, here's 100 gallons of LSD. Or
precursor,
Yeah, exactly.
I think we're really belaboring a simple point, which is that, guys, the DEA lies.
Shocker.
Yeah, it's not just the DEA though; it's all law enforcement that's
Yep.
using
Wait,
everything they can for their
you mean
advantage.
police and prosecutors lie to put people in jail too? Shit.
Almost like all cops are bastards. Anyway, so
Yeah. So what happens after? I just want to get back to the chronology here. What happens after?
So I'm
Afterwards with
pretty
Skinner.
sure. So I've gone through the shroomery is this, you know, I don't know if it's quite the caliber of the DMT Nexus, but it's one of these longstanding forums for the psychedelic underground to communicate with itself. And there was a kind of like now archived thread where someone had raised that initially the specter of Crystal Cole, Neurosoup, and basically saying, she was involved with Skinner and torturing this guy. Like, why are we still supporting her involvement in the community? And then as part of that thread, eventually Brandon Green, first via a proxy and then himself, came into the conversation directly. And so Crystal basically was Todd's girlfriend. She met him at a strip club, and I think I remember reading somewhere that at first she was like, oh, I didn't know Amish guys go to strip clubs, to describe she thought Skinner was this Amish guy based on his beard and everything. But then they got involved, and it was more appealing for her to go get involved in Skinner's underground party scene than, you know, what anything else she was doing. And then part of that process, she ended up getting involved. First invited Brandon to help deal, and as Brandon has described, deal drugs, you know, locally, because kind of via Skinner getting big quantities of stuff and then giving it smaller quantities to Brandon as a way of distributing. And then she became romantically linked to Brandon, and Brandon describes her as his first love. So that's the context of like these relationships. And I believe I remember Brandon saying that he got involved while they were involved in the Leonard case. So he didn't meet Leonard then because he was already arrested, but he was involved with Skinner before Skinner got arrested, after Leonard got arrested. So the shroomery basically has Brandon Green's version of what happened.
Yeah, and I mean if people are sort of confused about the whole thing, like Gordon Todd Skinner also actually married another woman. It was a chemist named Emily Reagan, had a child. So like these are not exactly exclusive monogamous relationships we're talking about here. The silo that all this occurred in Kansas, the missile silo.
It was a decommissioned missile silo that lay dormant for quite a while, many years, and then eventually Skinner took over one of the silos and converted it, had imported Italian marble. There's accounts, had this, you know, top of the line sound system that he never fully paid for, jacuzzi, multiple showers. So it was turned into this like underground party palace / dungeon.
There you go. Yeah. Just important to note.
And so they're traveling. Gordon and Crystal are traveling around the country. They're hopping to like, I think Seattle, and then
Las Vegas,
West Coast, Vegas, Tucson, right?
Yeah, and sometimes Skinner was, because I think Skinner would go off to this pregnant, you know, wife or whoever, and then while Crystal stayed behind, she would be hanging out with Brandon, etc.
Yeah, and so then there was this feels cheap to call it an incident, but basically there was a point where my recollection is that Brandon and Crystal had been talking about getting away from Skinner, and because
Skinner was becoming increasingly unwell as well, because they were taking all kinds of crazy drugs all the time, and he was getting paranoid because he was being watched and followed at this point. And at first Brandon and Crystal were like, dang, maybe we should, you know, get out of this while we can, and you know, turn in Skinner and say, you know, we want out of this situation. And I think that Brandon and Crystal had becoming closer, and so I think there was some animosity with Skinner. But basically,
go ahead.
Oh, I was
going to say on the Hamilton getting high on crystal piece, right? Crystal herself says, oh, we tried to turn in Skinner. We went to the local police. We sort of shared what was going on with his local operation. They were familiar with the Pickard bus. They were aware sort of who Skinner was and all of this. We gave them all of this information and they didn't do anything. And instead Skinner found out and showed up, and he was not happy that we had tried to turn him in. And then this becomes, an ongoing horrific account of torture of Brandon Green.
Basically, Skinner's really mad, and he tells Crystal to basically lure Brandon to this hotel room. And so Brandon has no idea what he's getting involved in, but then it turns into this multi-day saga of forced injections of all kinds of drugs and physical torture, really twisted, prolonged torture over days.
It was a 6-day ordeal, I think is better than incident, in a Tulsa hotel room. And I heard Crystal Cole's account where, she describes being kidnapped and tortured and sexually abused by Gordon Todd Skinner. And it wasn't until, at least for me, it wasn't until I read the This Island Press account in 2013 that I became aware that Brandon Green tells a very different story.
And his story, we should say, is corroborated by the eventual court testimony against Skinner, partially by a figure named Bill and other people who were also there, who say that they say that Crystal was actively involved in the torture, and she wasn't just an additional victim.
To the point that the court ordered Crystal Cole to pay Brandon Green $52,000 in restitution. To this day,
and he is to this day disabled, in pain every day, as a result of the torture that he was put through.
And for whatever it's worth, and there's both on the Shroomery and elsewhere, Brandon's put forward quite a bit of accounts, but just because I have it on hand from the pre-sentence investigation that the cops conducted. Part of Brandon's statement says, the amount of ways that Crystal Cole Skinner has destroyed my life and my potential is inconceivable. Even though Crystal did not directly use her own fist to hurt me, I hold her solely responsible for my kidnapping, torture, and attempted murder. Every day, several times a day, I'm reminded of the horrible situation Crystal put me through. The greatest amount of physical damage was done to my groin, hip, and pelvis. It hurts to urinate or use my sex organs in any sort of manner. And it goes on, and it's quite horrifying. And he concludes that little passage of a much longer section saying, I have too many permanent problems caused by Crystal to even try and summarize them all, to give the court an idea. And then he gives some summation of some of the truly horrific things that he experienced and continues to experience as a result.
And Dave, what's the date of that document?
This document is dated 2007. The sentencing date is given as 2007. I believe this document is also 2007. And to be clear, going back for a second to that Hamilton interview, there's no discussion of any of this. There's no, Crystal is allowed to play things off as though she was just some aw shucks. I was an unwitting patsy in these things, and I just didn't really know what was going on. And, there's other documents that indicate she had paid Green's rent for months in an attempt to avoid people coming around and asking questions about where he was at, what was going on.
He says that.
Yeah.
So just so we're clear, Getting High on Crystal appeared on Vice.com in 2011.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know how many views the
court? Say that again.
are you able to see the YouTube? Because the views are
I'm not
quite
on
high.
YouTube, but
Okay.
we can find out. Well, we'll take a look.
I
But I just wanted to say that those documents were a matter of public record at that point.
At that time, yeah. So it can't be said that that was like a journalistic thing that was done by Hamilton. It doesn't merit that kind of description. And then in terms of the account left on the Shroomery by Brandon, there were things like he was
has 3.
Sorry, what?
I think Normie was saying this is like 3 million views.
Yeah, it's 3.4 million views, and oh wait, hang on.
And that's it's been shared elsewhere as well. It's hosted on other.
That is not correct. I clicked the wrong thing.
Okay.
I can't find it on
YouTube.
Wait, here it is.
Sorry, Nishay, you were saying.
Brandon said
it's 17 million views.
Oh my God!
So quite a bit.
Again, plus other platforms and channels and places that aren't adding to that counter.
Right, and Brandon, he was dropped off like hundreds of miles in a field from where he had been tortured, and the medics.
Texas.
Yeah, he was able to like crawl his way to a road and get help, and the medics said that he was like within an hour of dying based on his vitals by the time that they actually found him. And there was one point where I think Brandon said, I forget if it was at that stage. I'm pretty sure when he was being dropped off, when like Crystal had like driven away, and she like busted a tire, and because it was a Porsche, it was Skinner's Porsche, and she couldn't get the right tire and had to wait, and was like annoyed to have to wait to get the tire fixed. And so all of that time could have been helping, but didn't, so, and he very almost did die. And that 50,000 she got out of having to pay. She didn't even have to, and that was really upsetting to him that she got away scot-free, because they wanted her as a what's the word when you're testifying against Skinner, a witness. Yeah, he was the bigger fish to put away.
Right.
And I wanted to point out that, I mean, Brandon Green's account is not just that that Crystal Cole participated in his abuse, his torture, but that she paid his rent 7 months in advance
so that people wouldn't know he was gone.
Yeah, I mean, there's also an account of her, and please correct me if I'm screwing this up, but she was wearing some dress, this dress that had been put together, right? That had been, I don't remember if it was like a wedding dress necessarily, or just like this ceremonial sort of all white getup that she ends up wearing during some of the torture. And I think he comments on sort of his horror that of all the times that this is being worn and displayed, it just presented this rather sick, fucked up
yeah, the account is
ritualization.
The account was something like out of the movie Hostel or something like that. It's that bad.
Vomit-inducing is one of the descriptions.
Yeah, and for people who want to look up these two Vice stories, the article is called Getting High on Crystal, and the YouTube is called Underground LSD Palace.
Oh, yeah.
There we go.
That's the one that has 17.7 million views. And yeah, this is the story. This is the story that pretty much everyone who's starting to look into the silo bust, this is that first account that they're introduced with, and that doesn't include any of this. They touch on it, but it's Crystal's account of that story, and so you wouldn't know about any of this from listening.
And while we're providing some sources, if you want to hear Brandon Green's account, as far as I know, one of the only real journalistic accounts of it, the This Land Press article, Subterranean Psychonaut by Michael Mason, Chris Sandel, and Leroy Chapman is where to go for that.
And we'll link that as well.
Yes, we will.
And one last thing about Brandon, like when he eventually did come forward, which was many years after the Shroomery account was many years after it actually happened, he was trying to he was seeing that a lot of people just had Crystal's version of what happened, and he was trying to correct the record. And he had some pretty unfortunate interactions. Like the reception from the community was, there were a lot of positive reactions later, but at first, like a lot of people, Brandon found Christianity as a way of helping him through like having been tortured by someone he was in love with at the time. And he was mentioning the Christianity on the forum, and a lot of people were like shaming him for being Christian, which just seemed like Pace mentioned that as being this like weird shadow aspect of the community, that a victim like of such a horrific abuse coming forward, and then they're just kind of like laughed away from like saying that they found Jesus, seems a little bit insensitive.
Yeah, and for whatever it's worth, and this is not to excuse it in any way, shape, or form, but the shroomery is kind of known for those, let's say, less than empathic responses, and that sort of like trolling and just shitty internet behavior, I would say.
You're not just saying that as a DMT Nexus pod.
No. I mean, look, like, I'll be real, like the shroomery has been hugely informative in my own life, and like I'm quite grateful for a bunch of the information that is stored there. And at the same time, the amount of bullshit that needs to be waded through, or the number of threads that are just absolute dumpster fires. The shroomery has some really amazing people and some really amazing knowledge. It's also, as Brandon's case evidences in part, like it's also got some really terrible behavior and comments, and I won't go so far as to say people, but I think too, looking at the way that communities, I don't know, welcome people back or attempt to engage, like this is something too, looking at some of the responses to the news of Pickard's release, and sort of comparing some of Brandon's reception versus Pickard's reception, the way certain public figures may be trying to frame their own relationships with Pickard, whether for personal clout or gain, looking at what goes on when somebody comes in from the wilderness, whether that's, recounting cases of horrific torture, or whether that's coming home from a long jail stint, whether that's, sort of anything relating to these criminal subcultures. This goes back to some of the issues we were talking about with MAPS and Halpern, and the way that we as people who participate in these communities engage with each other, and what sort of values, what sort of morals, what sort of ethics we want to see in the spaces that we're inhabiting. I think this case offers a number of points worth considering, and really underscores, I think, the way that we need to be conscious of and considerate of the dynamics that come with being part of a criminalized subculture, recognizing that many of us don't have certain protections that people not involved in criminal activities do have, just as a byproduct of how the legal system treats them. And I think looking, sort of to bring this back to some of the Pickard stuff, looking at his terms of release, looking at him. Apperson also got out. Sorry, we haven't even acknowledged that.
I was gonna mention that as soon as we.
So Clyde Apperson, who was also arrested in conjunction with the Silo bust, and was looking at 30 years, I think, based on he could have been out in something like 26,
28,
or 28. So Apperson is also out as a result of COVID, but in both cases, and Normie, maybe you know the specifics better than I, like their homes can basically be raided at any point for any reason. There's all sorts of draconian.
If the parole officer gives a reason.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I know, right, like even if they're in a state where cannabis is legal, technically they would violate the terms of their parole if they partook. I mean, there's a whole bunch of rather draconian measures. And so again, even what it takes at this point, having served a significant amount of time, looking at sort of reintegration into society, and recognizing that there's still sort of a number of hurdles and challenges, it feels important to acknowledge sort of all of the shit that comes with it.
I mean, just on top of all those conditions of parole, just you went into prison in the year 2000, and getting out back into the world in 2020. What the fuck is that like?
Totally.
Mm-hmm. And can I also mention, just to get back to real quick, Dave's point about the stories that we tell to like not extend empathy towards like, they're just drug dealers, they just got what they deserved, those kinds of narratives. There was someone this was back in 2015 in the Shroomery forum, who said, And they said they read this Land Press article. They said, I didn't, this is just a random poster. I didn't get the impression that Cole was so terrible. Green was a drug dealer and pimp himself. The truth of what actually happened seems like a coin toss. So it's like, these are all just bad characters. They chose to get involved in this stuff, and this is kind of what you get. But then Brandon responded to that. And he said specifically, I surely hope this doesn't come across as trying to justify my decisions as an immature teenager, because he was a teenager at the time, we should stress. But although I was a low-level drug dealer that smoked weed and sold to my friends, and the fact that I spent a short time managing with their permission, you know, and asking him to, my female friends who worked at a local high-end strip club, aka pimp, does not mean I ever deserve to be kidnapped against my will or sadistically tortured for an extended period. Yes, what I did was illegal, but in all honesty, I didn't feel there were very many legitimate financial opportunities as a teenager and full-time student in Oklahoma, getting back to capitalism, and my moral compass was pretty skewed at the time. And then he says, feeling like you have to do something illegal in order to get ahead in life sucks. People don't generally do that because they like just love being illegal, despite what people might, you know, portray them as. He says, but what sucks even more is being kidnapped and tortured, never fully recovering, and then randomly reading posts online with people thinking that I probably deserved what I got. So I just thought that was worth sharing.
Good God, yeah.
And to get that from a, you know, from a fucking drugs forum, right? To get that sort of response from people who are actively involved. And it's like, look, like the notion of ridiculing the guy because he found Christianity and was able to find some sort of compassion and empathy from folks in that community. It's like, well,
he was able to
look at the responses.
Find meaning in his suffering. Like, if a tortured person is going to find that, you know, like, that's great. That should be great and celebrated.
Well, and absolutely. And you compare that with the reactions that he's getting from Shroomery, and it's like, you know, what the fuck do you expect? Like how, you know, like, again, going back to communal values and the way that we engage with ourselves, the way we engage with people who are involved in the same sort of activities that we may have been involved in at whatever point, like, you know, this raises fundamental questions about what it means to be in relation to people, whether that's in virtual community, whether that's in physical community, whether that's in sort of your work relationships, looking at Maps and Halpern and things like that. You know, these aren't simple or these aren't insignificant questions. I think these are at the heart of so much of what's going on, and they frequently get glossed over in really shitty ways.
Yeah, and I would say that, I mean, no matter what, this moment right now with Leonard out of jail, breathing the free air again, Crystal Cole's still posting videos on YouTube.
Yeah, we didn't mention that. She did like her hot take on Leonard getting out.
She said, hey guys, everybody's emailing me and messaging me saying, wow, Leonard Pickard came out. And I mean, I only met him a couple of times. And of course, you know, he went to jail because, well, you know, Gordon turned him in. So she made a video about it. And then she said, hey, read my book. And guess what? I'm going to read your book, Crystal. It's a little fucked up to put your book out there.
To flex your book when you're like, yeah.
Somebody just did 20 years. But
yeah, it seems a bit weird for someone in her position to be like using it as an opportunity to advertise herself.
Yeah. So where we are right now is 20 years distant from the events that occurred in Kansas and in several other states. Yeah, we are in a period of reevaluation, and we can see that, you know, some of these members got extreme media coverage. Crystal Cole was quite the celebrity for a little while.
Yeah, I mean, she if she had continued on YouTube the way she had, I mean, those early YouTubers are now, you know, multi-million followers and stuff. So she did back down, but she was the kind of well known for those early videos series she made.
And perhaps, you know, I think there's a good argument to be made that the, you know, the community antipathy for that person rising beyond a certain level likely prevented that from happening. Something that we've seen a couple of times, and I would even say some things that we've participated in our role as a watchdog, just putting certain things on record. Pickard wrote a book. So yes, he's told his story at least in one format. And we hope that he can tell more aspects of his story once he's had time to breathe the free air. But one individual who has not really been highlighted in any way, shape, or form is Brandon Green and his story. It's not for lack of him wanting to tell it.
And his bravery and coming forward and, you know, being willing to answer like every question from random internet shit posters, you know?
Right.
Totally.
Yeah, it must be really fucked up to be a victim of torture like that, and then see Vice come out with, you know, with that story. I think there's a lot of I don't know. I don't know how you put that out. I think it's quite
Well, I mean, and I guess I know we generally don't edit, but we can cut this if I'm spilling the beans or engaging with things I'm not supposed to. But as I understand it, part of the plan is to try to collaborate with Brandon to put some of this out there.
We've gotten in touch with him. We don't know yet, you know, how much he wants to do or share, and, you know, beyond what he's already put out from the Shroomery, but hopefully there's scope for some collaboration there. We'd really like to help, you know, shift the discourse away from the Hamilton Morris Crystal Cole version of things. Mm-hmm. And we're also going to be doing, sorry, just real quick while we're plugging stuff and talking about
Plug
stuff.
Away.
We're planning to do a Rose of Paracelsus reading group. So if you are into reading kind of literary prose and want to know more about this crazy story, like, be in touch. And I just definitely, either way, I recommend people get that book and read it because it's really worth your time.
It's beautifully written.
Yeah, and honestly, to come read it with a group that includes Nishay, given the high praise she's received from the author, and you know, being able to add those various contextual bits based on her own correspondence and insights and understanding, I know I'm certainly looking forward to it quite a bit.
Ditto.
So. Yeah, and feel free to shoot us an email at the hi@symposia.com account if you're interested in participating. We're currently sort of pulling this all together. It's going to take us a little bit, but by all means, please reach out.
I just would like to say as well that, you know, where we are once again, I mean, it's really kind of interesting that, I mean, yes, there's a COVID angle to, you know, that's what ultimately was the cause of Pickard's compassionate release. But, you know, it seems timely that this, you know, legendary figure, this folk hero, really just the response that, you know, Nishay, you were talking about, you know, commenters saying, like, referring to LSD as the gift. I think that you don't have to go very far these days to find somebody whose life and emotional well-being, spiritual world has been positively impacted by, you know, the use of LSD.
Well, and it's like the book is really a call to the community and a way of, you know, helping to shift culture in a way that it can embrace and integrate some of the more profound aspects of psychedelic experience. So not only was he creating the substance, but he's actually actively spent his time behind bars trying to create a context wherein those kinds of insights could be meaningfully incorporated. And there's this one correspondence I found in Timothy Leary's archive when I was a, you know, visiting fellow there. Someone was writing to Leary about there's all this drama going on, and he's like, get the books written, for they will outlive us. I'm planning for that to be the epigraph to my book that I'm writing. But it really stands out because it's like that shifting of culture, shifting the discourse. Yeah. And also he had someone tweeting for him while he was in prison. And there's this kind of like liquidy stain on the cover of the book, and there's this sort of, I've written about this like elsewhere, this is, he was like, what could that liquid be on the cover? And it really is designed to invoke through this language that he uses to describe it the kinds of experiences that are being described. So just to throw all that out there.
Yeah, and I mean, I really just wanted to close the comment that I was trying to say, that, you know, the outpouring of interest and support I think it's indicative of the impact that this individual has had, even in people's imaginations, given that he has denied that he was, the supplier of 90% of the world's acid at any one point in time. But, the idea of a folk hero like this that is, specifically persecuted by the United States government, that is a non-state actor, that at least at some point in his life as an LSD chemist has directly impacted the lives of many people. Like, I think that there's something really interesting about that.
Well, and I'd also, to problematize things a little bit, not in the case of Pickard, but just more broadly. I mean, not only is this another moment where we find ourselves sort of standing at the intersection and contradictions of the standard story, and sort of all of the questions around it and challenging narratives, but also, as we look at the case of this folk hero who's been released from prison amidst the state's acknowledgement that BOP is unable and perhaps even unwilling to deal with the deadly fallout of a pandemic, the reality is we still have tons of people who are incarcerated, many of whom, I was just reading the other day of a guy who's serving a life sentence as a result of stealing a pair of gardening
clippers.
shears.
Yeah.
Like, what the fuck? And so like, it's great that Pickard is out, and yet we still have, a shitload of people who are locked up, primarily like Black, brown, and poor folks who in many cases, like the criminal acts that they have committed aren't actually harmful to other people, right? These are behaviors that have been criminalized because they serve certain socioeconomic ends. And so I think recognizing, in this moment and more generally, like the role of abolition, the role of questioning what purpose prisons serve more generally, the types of social control that are factoring into the world that we live in. No question, I'm thrilled that Pickard is out, and so many people are not.
We get what you're saying.
He was privileged to have, a fantastic team of lawyer who was working and willing to make the case and file those papers, but then not everybody has access to, caliber lawyer. Norman, I know you have, experience with that yourself. It's getting dark here because I have to wrap soon, so maybe we should.
No worries.
Well, I mean, just to Dave's point, to try and bridge them, I would say, like a character like William Pickard, where people say, well, that's not right, that's not fair, or even like, why should that guy be in prison because he's done some things that actually are good. I think it's a real important starting point for some people who haven't done a whole lot of questioning about this sort of thing. I 100% agree that, we should abolish prisons and we should abolish police. I've long argued that, prisons are labor policy in the United States. That's an extension of slavery, as argued by many other, scholars. But I mean, the discourse like needs to evolve to where this is just this is how we understand things, and then we struggle to make it reality. We need to let people out of fucking jail,
Totally.
Maybe we should end there, unless there's something
that's a great place to end.
Okay. Abolish prisons.
Abolish prisons.